Well, thank you, Harry, and good morning, everybody. I don't think this lectern is designed for my nice red folder, but it's great to see you, and looking forward to taking a few questions afterwards as well, though I'm not sure I'll be able to do 300, especially if they're very data-focused. But it's fabulous to be able to talk to you today as business people about the green industrial revolution. War in Europe, inflation in double digits, and a climate in crisis. The 8th Sustainability Week is meeting, Harry, at a critical juncture. And as you heard yesterday, I think from Antonio Guterres, the UN report last week warned what would happen if we don't limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's why we must do everything in our power to preserve our future. So I'm here to talk about what the government is doing to create the environment for a green industrial revolution. Because with new innovation, new industries and new investment, we can turn what is a global threat into an opportunity from net zero while protecting the planet for generations to come. From farms to factories, from horsepower to steam power, and from barter to business. The first industrial revolution gave the world prosperity and modernity. Jobs moved from the countryside to the city. Business moved from congregations to corporations. And energy moved from water mills to coal mills. Cheap, plentiful, and reliable energy was essential in growing the world's economy. And that equation remains true today. Since 2010, the UK has seen £198 billion of investment into low-carbon energy through a mixture of government funding, private investment, and levies on consumer bills. Building on this, yesterday the Prime Minister and the Energy Secretary announced a ream of measures to power up Britain. A homegrown, balanced diet is the perfect recipe for our energy requirements. That's why we will deliver, and launched yesterday, Great British Nuclear. By 2050, a quarter of the UK's electricity will come from nuclear sources, up from 15% today, as we bring about a renaissance in our nuclear industries. We'll deliver a hydrogen economy. The government announced a £240 million net zero hydrogen fund in order to kickstart the sector. By 2030, the hydrogen economy will support more than 9,000 jobs and unlock £4 billion of private investment. Also by 2030, we'll be producing 10 gigawatts of hydrogen every year, enough, in fact, to power the whole of the City of London. And we will deliver more renewable energy capacity. We're targeting 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by the end of this decade, from around 14 gigawatts today, enough to power every home in the UK. And we're going to increase solar capacity from roughly the same 14 gigawatts to up to 70 gigawatts by 2035. But what are we going to do about heavy industry and other polluting sectors that a modern economy simply cannot live without? Well, as it happens, we're blessed with one of the largest CO2 storage potentials of any country in the world. The UK continental shelf accounts for a significant share of all of Europe's CO2 storage potential and can safely store 78 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide, which, interestingly, is equivalent to the entire emissions of the UK from around the start of the Industrial Revolution to 2020. The government is determined to see the UK become a world leader in CCUS technology, helping to attract new private capital to develop green technologies and drive forward the UK's green industrial revolution. So yesterday, the first CCUS clusters were announced. The projects were announced that will be funded to capture CO2 before it is then piped and stored under the ground, following the £20 billion funding package announced by the Chancellor in the spring budget. So up to 50,000 jobs in that sector will be created by 2030. So all of this will help lead to the UK decarbonising its energy supply by 2035. It's important to remember the UK has led, of all the major economies in the world, leads on its reductions in emissions since 1990. The largest reductions among the G7, and thanks to the Climate Act, which we passed in 2008, which committed us legally to an 80% reduction, and then we changed that in 2019 to net zero, effectively net 100% removal of carbon emissions by 2050. Thanks to that and the 5-yearly carbon budgets, the Independent Committee on Climate Change, we are pretty much alone as a nation in being on a sure pathway to 2050 in order to lead. The transition to net zero will require action across the whole economy, but it comes with fantastic opportunities. There are about 250,000 jobs in the sector today, 55 billion of turnover last year, but as McKinsey said, there could be £1 trillion market opportunity by 2030 for the UK. Net zero and economic growth, as I think you in this room are aware, go hand in hand. We have a tremendous track record for inviting investment into green industries. But much like the 19th century, where our coal was the most efficient in the world, we have natural strengths as we race towards the green industrial revolution. We currently, just off the coast of my constituency in East Yorkshire, we have the largest offshore wind farm in the world. As it happens, we also have the second largest, the third largest, and the fourth largest, taking advantage of our shallow seabeds and magnificent coastline. You just need to look at a map of Europe and you can see the potential the UK has to harness all that energy in the seas around us and convert it into super competitive clean electricity going forward. As I said, we also have one of the greatest CO2 storage potentials of any country, and taking advantage of our geology and the North Sea oil and gas infrastructure and expertise, we're in a great position to exploit that and provide that as a service to the rest of Europe as well that isn't blessed with that CO2 potential. We have the best finance centre in the world, which will be the first to align with net zero, taking advantage of easy access to the flow of global capital. We have rich and varied investment opportunities across the energy supply chain in new industries to support decarbonisation and in the decarbonisation of existing industries. But if we want more success, we've got to keep pushing ahead. Others are following in our path. We've seen the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is a massive state subsidy of green industries there. We've had an EU response, but the world is following. And of course, it was under our presidency of COP when my colleague Alex Sharma became the president of the COP, just 30% of global GDP was covered by net zero pledges, 30%. By the time we'd finished our COP and Alex stood down, it was over 90%. The world has recognized the science is really no longer arguable, and we all need to act. We will reduce energy bills at home by increasing energy efficiency, including an extra £1 billion for upgrades through the Great British Insulation Scheme, which we launched yesterday. We're investing to speed up the market for heat pump installations, leveraging up to £300 million of private funding. And we're supporting greener methods of travel, including a £1 billion investment in electric vehicle charging to boost that infrastructure around the country. But overall, it's the market, not the government. It's people in this room, rather than people like me, that can make the green industrial revolution a reality. We all need to take action together. And I've been struck by how enthusiastically British business, from the largest PLCs down to the smallest SMEs, have set science-based net zero targets and joined the UN-backed Race to Zero initiative. This includes 2/3 of the FTSE 100 and almost 4,000 UK SMEs who are signed up to date. It's a tremendous achievement. So if you haven't already done so, please join. We'll also be standing up a new net zero business and investment group. And the group will build on the momentum from my colleague Chris Skidmore's net zero review and will be a key step in addressing the recommendations that he made. Businesses are leading the way on net zero, and to make sure that this continues, I ask that you all publish your transition plan for your business on net zero and make sure that it continues and is a live document. It can set out the actions over the short and medium term, show ambition, join initiatives such as the First Movers Coalition, EV 100 and RE 100, and these will help you deliver on your net zero commitments and inspire others. Lead the way, amplify your leadership and set out expectations for major international and climate moments. Because the green revolution has already begun. There is a global race to capture the jobs, export opportunities, and a share of what's projected to be a $10 trillion green global industry by 2050. We all want to take advantage of those opportunities. None of us want to be left behind. We share the earth, the air, and the oceans, of course, with everybody else, and that's why it's essential that we face the challenges of climate change together. We work closely with the UN, the G7, the G20, and countries from all over the world, including vulnerable countries, big emitters, and future COP presidencies, to keep up the global momentum towards net zero. But it's, of course, developing countries that are on the front line in the fight against climate change. That's why Britain committed to a doubling of its international climate finance to £11.6 billion from financial years 2021 to 2 to 2025 to 6, and £1.5 billion of adaptation finance for 2025. So the International Climate Finance Strategy we published yesterday sets out how we will deliver on our contribution to the UNFCCC's commitment jointly to mobilise $100 billion of climate finance a year for developing countries. That money will be used to protect the world's most vulnerable communities, to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, and to prepare for the future that will include more once-in-a-generation catastrophes. And at least $3 billion will go to nature and biodiversity projects, because we believe in nature-based solutions wherever possible. And I was just discussing that with Paul Polman just now. We're determined to keep 1.5 degrees alive, to give Mother Nature a fighting chance. The strategic framework for international climate and nature action was also published yesterday, shows the role that the UK will play internationally in this critical period up to 2030, working with others, because it's collaboration, not just competition, which will deliver a clean environment for everyone. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest risk here is not the cost of net zero, the cost of missing out. The public, the government, and the ESG investors all want you to seize the opportunities of the green industrial revolution. We can provide an affordable, clean and secure energy supply. We can provide backing for industries such as carbon capture, hydrogen production, and jet zero. And you can provide the initiative, innovation, and investment to ensure a healthy planet with a healthy economy. Please enjoy the rest of the event, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today.
Thank you very much, Minister. I particularly like the point about the homegrown balanced diet and growth. I think I personally will need to go on a homegrown balanced diet after 3 days of eating cookies to keep me alive running an event. In all seriousness, no, the Minister's very kindly said he'll take a few questions from the audience this morning. So if you'd like to ask a question, we're going to be old school. If you'd like to raise your hand and ask the Minister a question, so please do that. If anyone would like to ask a question, I can see a first one there at the back. Thank you, Madam.
Hello. I'd just like to ask, given the advice of the International Energy Agency about the role of fossil fuels, I guess I'm interested to understand how the UK government can continue to support new fossil fuel projects.
Thank you. It's a great question. Let me deal with that, and I think it's a really important conversation we have, because in a sense, I think, as the applause shows, there's a sort of almost a social license for new oil and gas projects, for instance, is almost disappearing. But we are, right now, the energy mix of the most decarbonised major economy in the world is 75% fossil fuel. 75%. We are utterly dependent for heat, light, jobs, on fossil fuels. What we have to do is accelerate the transition away, but accept it is a transition. Under net zero, we will be using gas and oil in 2050 and beyond, under net zero, about a quarter of the gas we have today. And in the North Sea, we have a declining basin. We are net importers of both gas and our oil when netted out. And the idea, and we also have increasingly efficient production, reducing upstream emissions. And we've got the industry committed to a 50% reduction by 2030. So if we don't produce with, say, new oil and gas from the North Sea, if we don't have new licenses coming forward, we will, as a result, we won't be able to import more gas from Norway, which is probably about the greenest in the world. We will have more tankers bringing in liquid natural gas to the UK. And those tankers carry gas with about 2.5 times the emissions of gas produced domestically. So if we don't have any new licenses in the North Sea, a declining basin where we're net importers, we will be paying billions or tens of billions, possibly hundreds of billions over the years for oil and gas from abroad, which has higher emissions when used and as a result of being produced than if we'd done it at home. We will lose the enormous economic benefits and fiscal benefits. It's a very highly taxed sector, 75%. It's what's helped the government pay half of everyone's electricity and gas bills this winter, is the windfall tax on oil and gas. And we will lose the engineering, balance sheet, and engineering capability of the oil and gas giants, without whom we will not be able to deliver the hydrogen and carbon capture technologies which the Committee on Climate Change and every other expert pretty much accepts you can't get to net zero without. So you tell me, in what world would it be more sensible for us not to have oil and gas licenses in the North Sea when they will be greener, they'll be domestic, they'll be produced at home, and they're entirely compatible with what is, in our case, a legally obligated pathway to net zero? Sorry it was so long, but it's a really important argument.
That was a good answer. I think the lady here at the front was next. If we can have a microphone just here. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. I want to ask you about affordability. You talked about affordable clean energy, and you talked about, in your papers yesterday, about it being affordable for all. Energy efficiency reduces our need for energy, but it's a slow process. What are you going to do about households that are suffering from fuel poverty already?
Thank you very much. That's another great question. The best form of energy is energy we don't use. And if we can build greater energy efficiency in our businesses, in our buildings, and in our homes, then that's something we need to do. We inherited in 2010, it's not a political point, it's just a reality, I think just 14% of homes in 2010 were properly insulated. Over the last, whatever it is, 13 years, we've moved to nearly half. So it's been a transformation. We're spending £6.5 billion in this Parliament. We announced yesterday the Great British Insulation Scheme with another billion to target 300,000 additional homes on top of all the others we're working on, which are least energy efficient. And the Chancellor announced another 6 billion from 2025 to 2028. But you're absolutely right. The best energy is energy use avoided. And it has, as you also highlight, the enormous benefit of reducing the number of people in fuel poverty. So we are looking to transform our housing stock and our building stock precisely in order to make sure that we don't use any energy we don't need to. And by doing so, it'll not only make us more economically efficient, it'll not only contribute to our environmental goals, but more importantly still, it'll reduce the numbers of people in fuel poverty.
That was a very good question, thank you. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions. I believe this gentleman here was next. Yeah, if you can pass the microphone, or gentleman or lady, I'm sorry, my eyesight's not very good from this distance.
Thank you so much, Minister, for the talk. So the UN Secretary General put out a 10-point recommendation list for addressing greenwashing. And one of those recommendations was to align lobbying and advocacy with net zero goals. And so given that we have 90% of the world economy now committed to net zero, are you finding that 90% of the lobbying and advocacy that you receive is aligned with net zero? And of course, that's crucial to help you do your job well and push that forward. So thank you.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I'm not remotely in a position to answer it, except to say I take on board the point behind it. Of course, I think the big opportunity for us, I mean, I went to my first COP in 2005 in Montreal, and everyone was having great theological discussions about the certainty of climate change. And sometimes for those who are into it, there's a sort of desire to separate those who aren't believers, the skeptics versus the believers, and split us. I'm not directly answering your point, but I've always felt actually everybody should be on the same page. If we can align the corporate interests, including, oil and gas companies, if we can align them with genuinely give them a future in a net zero world, then they're not going to oppose us, neither are the petro-states. It's not a direct answer to your question. What I always look to do is see how I can get everybody to see, A, that the science is really, pretty unarguable, though I'm happy to have an argument with anyone who wants to have it, and skepticism's good. But let's look at a way that we can make it work for everybody. And if we can align as many people as possible with this trajectory, and they can see a future and indeed a profit in it for themselves, then actually we won't be having battles. We won't have to be looking under the bed for some lobbyist who's fighting against us, because actually we've got companies making a change. So I was at CERA Week, a big energy. It used to be the big oil and gas event in Houston. It's now energy event, of course. But it's fascinating to see the impact that the Inflation Reduction has had in America. Suddenly they're being paid to produce hydrogen. They're getting paid to do carbon capture. And suddenly you've got big oil corporations going, we can do this. If we can align them, and then they can lobby away for further action, accelerated action on climate change, because they think they'll make more money. That's when getting all these things aligned is going to allow us to do it, because at the moment we are not on track. So picking more enemies to fight, while we're enlightened and they're the enemy, isn't going to get us there. What we've got to do is, from countries, China's the world's largest emitter, to corporations, petro-states, we've got to show them all, actually it's in their interest to get aligned with this, and that's very much it's going to be interesting with an event hosted by a petro-state in the form of UAE. But of course, Sultan Al Jaber, characterized as an oil man running the state oil company, put in charge of a COP. It's an outrage. Actually, he was a renewables man. He founded Masdar, the second largest generator of renewables in the world, and was sent into ADNOC, the oil company, in order to eliminate their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which he's worked at. So I'm not saying they get everything right, but the more we can align people and work together and not make them the enemy, I think the more likely we are to get over the line.
Another very good question, a very good answer. Although my team might kill me, I'd like to take one more, if that's okay with you, Minister, even though we're overrunning, because the questions have been so good. I'm conscious I've taken quite a few from this side of the room. Is there a question on this side of the room that hasn't been answered? Please do raise your hand. The gentleman there.
From the right side of the audience brain.
Yes.
The way we're looking at it, anyway.
And this will be our last question. To you, sir.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. I enjoy your presentation. What I want to ask is that what are you doing for EMDEs Africa in terms of developing carbon markets? Because we need to catch up. So we've not seen those assistance from the Western world in terms of developing the carbon markets and how we can do sequestration over there.
Great question, thank you. Of course, the developed world promised to give $100 billion a year, which on the one hand is a kind of drop in the ocean, on the other was a solemn promise by the developed rich countries, and it has not been delivered. And the fact that it's not delivered undermines trust, and therefore we really do need to fix that and get that right. But we are doing a lot. Coming out of COP26, we had what we call the breakthrough agenda. That's very much looking at sectors and gathering countries together, going really deep into sectors to work out how we decarbonize them. And another part of that architecture, sort of implementation architecture, was to look at what we do with individual countries. So, for instance, we've done a Just Energy Transition Partnership, a JETP we called it, with South Africa, and mobilizing private and public finance behind their transition in order to help drive down costs in that economy, and again, align the interests there so that people there, ordinary people in South Africa, don't think they're just going to lose jobs in coal. They're actually going to have better paid other jobs in clean industries. So we're doing that in South Africa. I'm proud of the work my department does. I can't remember whether we've announced it yet or not. But we've got further funding for innovation in developing countries. We're a leader in that space, and of course, and need to do so much more to live with the realities in different African nations of their economies, things like cold storage, getting new technology in, allowing it to be rolled out, because then the businesses there will have lower bills and much lower emissions. And there's just so much more we need to do to support the developing world going forward, including in Africa. But I think we're hosting another UK-Africa Investment Summit. I helped organise the last one when I was a trade minister next year. And that saw, I think, in total around 15 billion of investment into Africa overall. And with agencies like the UK Export Finance, which is our credit agency, and others absolutely aligned now with net zero and doing everything they can to champion it. I hope we are working constructively with Africa and other nations to do our bit to help them see that it's in their interest to do this as well, because after all, if we don't get it right, it won't be the UK that pays the highest price. It'll be the poorest people in the poorest countries. And we've got to make sure that we're all together globally in tackling this. But of course, all the business people in this room can do their bit as well. And thank you for your question.
Thank you. If we could have a big round of applause for the Minister. Thank you for those good questions from the audience.